So, new style of video, a new format, new ways to go on tangents forever. All I need to do now is start off with a corny tree pun. Hey, welcome back. So first, let's get the pine tree in the room out of the way. There's a new look to things and a more casual approach. If you're curious, be sure to stick around till the end, so I can tell a little bit more about that. It's been a while since I've posted a scripted video. That's mostly because I've been working on a few other things and generally haven't had much time to make anything. So let's do something a little bit less technical. Maybe that will help things. So, since it's Pride Month, let's talk about labels. Maybe you wouldn't expect fractals to pop up in here, but there are a few that are interesting to have a look at. So, let's begin. To start off, I would like to ask the question of why we label things. Well, that way it's easy to tell things apart. But how do we do that? To answer that question, let's start off with a certain number of objects and see what we can do to keep track of them. One way would be to give every single object a different symbol. Now, that's all well and good, but if you were to do that for every single object, you would have an equal number of symbols, and that's not very useful. We also can't give two objects the same symbol. That would lead to confusion, so this is what we'll do. After, I don't know, as many fingers as I have in different symbols, I'll start again and add the first symbol next to it. That way I can show that one loop of as many fingers as I have has been completed. And I can do the same with the loops of the loops and the loops of the loops of the loops and so on. Clearly what I've just done there is count objects in base 10. It allows you to keep track of objects in an organized way, but did you know that this way of keeping track of objects actually has a few fractal-like properties? Let me explain. If you've got 10 or less objects, you have one set. But to be able to keep track of more than 10 objects, what you'll do is make another set and assign a different symbol to it so that you can keep track of all the objects you're counting. And now that you've got two sets, you'll need to assign a different symbol to each of them so you can keep them apart. And as you might be able to see, you'll be able to do that about 10 times until you'll have to make another larger set to encompass two of these smaller sets. In this case, the set will then have two subsets. So now we can have a set of 100 objects, which are then 10 subsets of 10 objects. To give a better example, let's look at the number 5424. Here we can see that there are 5 subsets of 1000, plus 4 subsets of 100, plus 2 subsets of 10, plus 4 more objects. Well, that's the most practical way of counting the objects here, although a few people would probably disagree with me. There are different number systems that can be used to count, obviously, but even within base 10, you could theoretically group things in different ways. You could, for instance, group 5000 into 5 sets of 1000, but you could also group things in 500 sets of 10 objects. So while you can refer to these in their largest form, you can split them up in smaller subsets. And what you'll end up with is subsets of different subsets. And it looks like there's some self-similarity, right? Now, that's all nice, but what does that have to do with labels and pride, you might ask? We assign labels to people, right? We don't assign numbers to them. Or do we? Well, actually, your social security number, for instance, is a number. and whenever you sign up for a service, you'll be customer X for a certain company. And even whenever you're in the hospital for a clinical test, your sample is reduced to a number, which might be a little bit dehumanizing, but it's practical. Now, what I've just shown you with the numbers, sets and subsets shows up in a ton of other places, but there aren't always numbers, so you might need to look a little bit closer to find them. One of those examples would be phylogeny is the study of observing organisms and recording to which species they are related. Now, when it comes to all the living organisms that we've observed this far, they could be divided into domains, kingdoms, phylums, classes, orders, families, genuses, and species, though variations in categorization exist. So roughly the job of a phylogeneticist is concerned with classifying organisms based on characteristics that set them apart from others, and that with increasing specificity. To give an example, let's have a look at Quercus bicolor, which is otherwise known as the swamp white oak. Speaking of trees, when you do this for every known organism and trace which species and trace back to what subsets they are part of, what you'll end up with is the phylogenetic tree. If you're curious about how this works in a little bit more detail, Aron Ra on YouTube has a very informative series of videos on phylogeny and the Phylogeny project, which is a project which attempts to map every species on the planet. And as you might be able to see, the phylogenetic tree has some self-similarity as well. So we're talking about subsets and sets again, but the main difference is that instead of numbers we've got difficult to pronounce names. This is what's called a nested hierarchy, and it has some interesting properties. For instance, once a particular organism falls within a particular category, it will belong to that category forever, but that doesn't mean it's the same as every other thing in that category. As an example, humans, elephants and palm trees are all eukaryotes. They belong to different hierarchies within the category of the eukaryotes, but they aren't in the same place. So you won't ever see elephants come from pine trees. I hope you're listening, Kent. So, what we've just done there is ask the question, if a tree falls in the forest, never mind that it falls, how do we know that it's a tree? Well, the answer is quite simple. We've just determined it by agreeing that we call it a tree, based on certain observable characteristics. But now let's ask the question, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody is around to hear it, what does it identify itself as? Unless we're talking about ants from Lord of the Rings, this might not necessarily be a very useful question. Because as far as we know, trees aren't sapient and aren't able to identify themselves. But this does make an interesting point in regards to labels being applied to people. Because unfortunately, people are quite awful but willing to apply labels to other people. This applies to many different categories, and often it in a way serves as a way of putting people into groups which may or may not be useful or even accurate. Which is why, in my opinion, it's vital that people themselves get to define who they are. Now, there is something I've noticed when it comes to how people label themselves. By the way, this is purely from my own observation, so feel free to just take it with a pinch of salt. There seems to be two components to labeling. A component that focuses on unity with other people, but also a component that focuses on creating individualism. This might seem a little bit contradictory, but to explain that, I'll give a run through of my own labels, simply because I can only talk for myself. So I'm a cisgender male, which means that my gender, which is different from sex, matches my sex I was assigned at birth. That's all pretty standard. However, when it comes to my orientation, I'm actually in a bit of a conundrum, because I like a lot of different people, which means that labeling becomes a little bit more tricky. Bisexuality is traditionally referred to as an attraction to both males and females, which completely ignores intersex people, but okay. If you go by a binary, that would technically include everyone, but it completely ignores gender and self-identification. More recent definitions have instead focused on genders rather than sex. Personally, I like the second one better, but it brings a few caveats. According to this definition, bisexuality can then be split up into 3 more categories: polysexual, pansexual, and omnisexual. Poly means attracted to more than one gender, but not all. Pan means attracted to anybody, and gender does not factor into attraction. And finally there's omni, which is also an attraction to all genders, and gender does play a role in attraction in this case. Now here's the interesting thing about that. This is a nested hierarchy, at least it seems to be. All these new categories are nested under bisexual, and in regards to labeling myself, there's a choice to be made. To either be more general and identify myself as bisexual, or be more specific and more individualistic and try one of the other labels. And I've chosen to do the former because I can't seem to figure out which of the more specific labels would fit me. Like, there isn't an exhaustive list of genders which I could view, so there is no way I can find out if I've examined every single gender. So I would have no way to differentiate between polysexual, pansexual or omnisexual. In addition to that, I'm also demisexual, which means I only tend to be attracted to people with which I've built a strong emotional connection, which makes figuring all this stuff out even more complicated. So a while back I found out that I'm able to be attracted to more than just women, and honestly it feels strange that people tend to be expected to choose between 2 arbitrary groups, which there aren't even 2 groups, there are more than 2 groups. And you know, why would you have to choose? People come in all shapes and sizes, and my ability to like them is not dependent on either gender or sex. Now, leaving aside my personal things, how does that impact the way other people label themselves? Well, honestly, you're going to have to ask other people because I can only talk about myself. But one thing I can tell is that definitions vary, which means that people will end up choosing different labels, and you don't get to tell other people what labels they should be using. As an example, it's not okay to say that pansexual is just bisexuality under a different label, because it's not. While it would technically work under the framework I just laid out, it's not acceptable to say that. People should have a say in the way they label themselves, because it's totally fine to do so. Let's cover one more thing. So, I mentioned earlier that when it comes to self-identification, there's kind of 2 components to labeling: being part of a particular group, but also being unique within that group. What seems to happen is that within labels, more specific labels seem to pop up as time goes on. This has happened several decades ago when bisexuality became its own category, and it continues to happen where things become more specific when gender is included, for example. And technically this could continue happening, as the only limiting factor to this is the number of individuals. And to that I say, go for it. Increase the complexity of this wonderful fractal. Happy Pride. So, because of time constraints, I've not been able to make too many large projects, like the Cobalt 60 video, which, well, that took a lot of time actually. Instead, I'll make some smaller videos with a more consistent format, so that the whole process is a little easier. Whether that will increase the rate at which I upload videos, I can't promise, but it does allow me to be a little bit more consistent. To give a little bit of a preview, I'm currently working on a collaboration with Justin Timmer. I won't spoil the topic yet, but his channel is in the description, so you can check out and perhaps make a little guess as to what the video might be about. And thanks to all the people who have subscribed over the last few months. It really motivates me to continue working on these videos. If I'm not making videos, I might occasionally pop up on Fractal forums. And since a few weeks, you can also check me out on Instagram, where I post pictures of trees I find in the wild. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more. So enjoy Pride Month, and remember, branch out into the unknown and reach out to others.